Good morning. My name is Annie, and I'd like to read you a story today. It won't all be today. It'll likely come in segments. I want to see how people react to it. But this book has been a beautiful experience for me to read, and I'd like to share it. Its title is Embraced by the Light by Betty J. Eadie. And she wrote this, or it was published at least, in 1942. The first night, something was wrong. My husband Joe had left my hospital room only a few minutes before, but already a foreboding feeling was enveloping me. I would be alone through the night, alone on the eve of one of the most frightening challenges. Thoughts of death began creeping into my mind. Thoughts like these had not come to me in years. Why were they so pervasive now? It was the evening of November 18th, 1973. I had entered the hospital to undergo a partial hysterectomy. As a 31-year-old mother of 7, who was in otherwise excellent health, I had chosen to follow my doctor's advice to have the operation. Both my husband, Joe, and I felt comfortable with this decision. I still felt comfortable with the decision, but something else was bothering me now. Something unidentifiable. In our years of marriage, we had rarely spent nights apart, and I tried to reflect on our family and the special closeness we enjoyed. Although we had 6 children at home, one had died of sudden infant death syndrome when she was an infant. We were sometimes reluctant to leave them. Even on our date nights, we would stay home and let the children plan our dates for us. Sometimes they catered a dinner for us, providing candle night in the living room, with a fire crackling in the fireplace. We usually just had the right music too. Maybe not the music we would have chosen, but perfect nonetheless. I recalled the evening they served us Chinese food on a decorated coffee table and provided large pillows for us to sit on. They turned the lights down low, kissed us good night, and giggled as I hurried up the stairs. Joe and I seemed to have found a little bit of heaven on earth. I reflected how lucky I was to have a companion as loving and considerate as Joe. He had taken vacation from work to be with me before I went to the hospital, and he planned to spend another week at home while I recuperated. He and our 2 eldest daughters, who were 15 and 14, were already making plans for a wonderful Thanksgiving dinner. The feeling of foreboding settled more heavily upon me. Perhaps it was the darkness of the room, the terrible darkness I had learned to dread as a girl, or maybe these omnibus feelings came from another experience, an experience in a hospital years ago, which still filled me with questions and wonders. When I was 4 years old, my parents had just separated. My father used to say that marrying an Indian woman back in those days was probably the worst thing a white man could do. He was a fair haired Scotch Irishman, and she was full blooded Sioux Indian, excuse me. As the seventh of 10 children, I hardly had a chance to know either parent before they separated. My mother went back to live on the reservation, and my father went to live with his parents in town. At that time, 6 of us children were placed in a Catholic boarding school. It was while at the boarding school that first winter that I developed a terrible cough and began shivering constantly. 40 girls shared one large room, and I remember leaving my bed one night and getting into my sister Joyce's bed. We lay together and cried, I in my fever, and she in a fear for me. When one of the sisters came by on her nightly round, she discovered me and took me back to my bed, which was damp and cold with perspiration. Joyce tried to convince the sister of my illness, but was unsuccessful. Finally, on the 3rd night, I was taken to a hospital. The doctor diagnosed me with whooping cough and double pneumonia and told a nurse to contact my parents. I remember him telling her that he didn't expect me to live through the night. As I lay on the bed, burning with fever, I seemed to slip in and out of sleep. Once I felt hands on my head, and looking up, I saw a nurse leaning over me. She ran her hands through my hair and said, She's just a baby." I'll never forget the kindness I felt in those words. I snuggled further down into the covers and felt warm and content. Her words gave me peace, and I closed my eyes to sleep again. I woke to the doctor's words. "It's too late. We've lost her." And I felt covers pulled up over my head. I was confused. Why was it too late? I turned my head and looked around the room, which didn't seem to be an odd thing, even though the covers were pulled over my face. I saw the doctor and nurse standing by the bed. I looked around the room and noticed that it was filled with brighter light than before. The bed seemed huge to me, and I remember thinking, "I'm like a little brown bug on this big white bed." And the doctor walked away, and I became aware of another presence nearby. Suddenly, I wasn't lying on the bed, but found myself in someone's arms. I looked up and saw a man with beautiful white beard looking at me. His beard fascinated me. It seemed to sparkle with bright light, a light that came from within the beard. I giggled and ran my hands through the beard and twirled it on my fingers. I felt perfectly calm and happy with him. He gently rocked me, cradling me in his arms. And although I didn't know who he was, I never wanted to leave him. "She's breathing again," the nurse called out. The doctors came running back into the room, but it was a different room. I had been moved into a smaller one that was very dark. The man with the white beard was gone. My body was wet with fever, and I was scared. The doctor turned the light on, and they took me back into the first room. When my parents arrived, they were told that they had almost lost me. I heard the words, but still didn't understand them. How could I have been lost if I was there the whole time? But it was good to be with my parents again, with people who really knew me and loved me, like the man with the white beard. I asked them who that man was and where he had gone, but they didn't understand what I was talking about. I told them about the doctor saying that it was too late and how the man with the white light in his beard had come and held me, but they had no answers. They never did. This experience would be mine to cherish as an oasis of love throughout my young life. The memory has never changed, and each time I remember it, I get a sense of calmness and happiness I had in his arms. I tried to recall these memories now as darkness seeped into my room. Since those early days away from my parents, darkness had terrified me. Now, alone in the darkness again, a strange feeling was in the room. Death seemed to swirl everywhere around me. My thoughts became filled with it, caught up in it. Death, death, and God. These two seemed eternally linked. What awaited me on the other side? If I were to die tomorrow, what would I find? Eternal death? Eternity with a vengeful God? I wasn't sure. And what was God like? I only hoped that he was not what I had learned as a child in boarding school. I can still remember the details of the first school building with its gigantic brick walls and dark, cold rooms. A chain link fence separated the boys' dormitory from the girls', and another fence ran along the perimeter of the school. We were locked in from the world and away from each other. I still remember that first morning when my brothers were ushered to one building while my sisters and I were led to another. I'll never forget the fear in their eyes as they looked back at us one last time. I thought my heart would break. My two sisters and I were taken to a small room where the nuns deloused us in chemicals and cut our hair. Then they gave us two dresses each, one color for 1 week and one for the following week. These uniforms would help identify runaways. Our oldest sister, Thelma, whom we called Sis, was separated from us and sent to another room for older girls. The first night, Joyce and I lined up with the other girls and marched into the room, where we stood by our beds and until the sister blew a whistle. Then we got promptly into bed. The light was clicked off and the door was locked from the outside. Being locked inside this big darkened room horrified me. In the dark, I waited in terror until sleep finally came. Gratefully, it overcame me. On Sunday, all the children attended church, which offered my sisters and me the possibility of seeing our brothers on the other side of the chapel. As I fought through the crush of girls to get a glimpse of my brothers that first Sunday, I felt a knock on my head. I I turned around and saw a long pole with a rubber ball on the end. The sisters used this instrument to correct our behavior in church, and this would be only the first of many times I felt it, because I found it difficult to understand what the balls meant and when I should kneel. I was tapped by the pole often. Still, though, I was able to see my brothers, and this was worth any punishment from the ball. We were taught about God there, and I learned many things I had never considered. We were told that we, the Indians, were heathens and sinners, and of course I believed this. The nuns were supposed to be special in God's eyes, and we learned that they were there to help us. My sister Thelma was often beaten by them with a little hose and was forced to thank the sister who had done it or be beaten again. These were God's chosen servants, and I believed as I began to fear God immensely because of them. Everything I learned about him intensified this fear. He seemed angry and impatient and very powerful, which meant that he would probably destroy me or send me straight to hell on Judgment Day, or before then if I crossed him. This boarding school God was a being I hoped never to meet. I looked at the large clock on the wall. Only minutes had gone by since Joe had left. Only minutes. The tiny light above the sink in my room produced only enough light to create dark shadows, shadows which hung in my imagination like nightmares from my past. My mind must be racing, I thought. Propelled by my isolation, my mind was racing through the dark corridors of my memories. I had to control it in order to find peace, or the night would be endless. I settled myself and tried to find happier thoughts from my past. A ray of light began to shine. Brainerd Indian Training School was run by Wesleyan Methodist. I'll never forget reading on my first day there was a large sign that stood in front of the school. Here there is no vision, or where there is no vision, the people perish. I thought, of course, that the sign referred to the Indians and that since this was training school, we were there to be trained to have more vision. This idea was probably reinforced by other signs I saw in town, such as no Indians or dogs allowed. Brainerd Indian Training School proved to be a more positive experience than my earlier ones had been. We enjoyed a cozy, less formal atmosphere, and the teachers seemed to appreciate being around the students. I learned that God meant different things to different people. Instead of the angry, vengeful God that I had come to know before, these people taught of a happier God, who was pleased when we were happy. In our devotionals, people often shouted Amen and Hallelujah, and it took a while to get used to their sudden outbursts. Although I recognized that there were different ways to view God and to worship Him, I think I remained convinced that He was still the God who would punish me if I ever died and appeared before Him. During summers, I attended both Lutheran and Baptist churches and occasionally the Salvation Army. Where I attended church then did not seem as important as the fact that I went. My curiosity about God grew as I matured, because I recognized that He was playing a major role in my life. I just wasn't sure what that role was or how it would affect me as I grew older. I approached Him in prayer to get answers, but I didn't feel that He heard me. My words just seemed to dissipate in the air. When I was 11, I summoned my courage and I asked our school matron if she really believed that there was a God. I felt that if anybody knew, she did. But instead of answering my question, she slapped me and asked how dare I question His existence. She told me to get to my knees and pray for forgiveness, which I did. But now I know that I was doomed to hell because of my lack of faith, because I had questioned the existence of God. I was sure now that I could never be forgiven. Later that summer, I moved back in with my father and had an experience that paralyzed me with fear. One night, after getting in bed, I opened the curtains to the window next to me and lay there gazing at the stars and passing clouds, something I had enjoyed doing since very young. Suddenly, my eye caught a ray of white light coming down from a cloud, and I was frozen with fear. It moved from side to side as if it were searching for us, for anybody. I knew that this was Jesus coming in His second coming, and I screamed at the top of my lungs. I had been taught that He would come as a thief in the night. and would take the righteous with him and burn the wicked. It was hours before my father could call me, finally convincing me that I had only seen a searchlight advertising the arrival of a carnival in town. It was the first searchlight I had ever seen. I closed the curtain and didn't stargaze for some time. My search for the true nature of God continued. I remembered attending various churches and memorizing many scriptures from the New Testament. I came to believe that when a person died, his spirit would remain in the grave with the body until resurrection day, when Christ would come and the righteous would rise up to be with him. I thought of this often, still dreading my own death and the blackness that would follow. The night deepens. The curtains of my hospital room were closed now. Had I closed them? I looked at the clock again, then almost got up to see if it was unplugged. Time seemed to stand still. I needed to talk to someone. Perhaps a nurse would come and visit with me, or better yet, I could call home. I reached across the bed and got the phone. Moments later, it was ringing, and Donna, our 15-year-old, answered it. She immediately asked if I was okay. It was wonderful to hear the concern in her voice. I told her that everything was fine, but I was a little lonely. Dad isn't home yet, she said. My heart dropped. I wanted so desperately to talk to him. Mom, are you okay? She asked. And I said, yeah, I'm fine. So what I wanted to say was, please get Dad and send him back. Get him here as soon as you can. My apprehensions were growing. I heard little voices over the phone. I want to talk to Mom. Hey, give me the phone. I'll tell Dad. And the sounds of home made me feel better. I spent the next half hour saying goodnight to each child. But when I hung up, the loneliness fell on me again like a blanket. The room seemed darker, and the distance between the hospital and our home felt more like a million miles than just across town. My family was life itself to me, and being away from them scared me, hurt me. But as I thought again of each of my children, and of course of my husband, Joe, I felt better. And at that point, nobody in the world could have convinced me that in only hours I wouldn't care if I ever returned home to them again. That, in fact, I would be begging not to return to them. I had always thought that my husband and children would eventually replace the family I had missed in my childhood. I had promised myself that when I married and began my own family, that they would be my prime interest, my greatest refuge. I promised myself that I would love my husband and remain with him through thick and thin, that our children would always be able to count on us being together. When I turned 15, I was sent to live with my mother. My father felt that a maturing young lady should be with her mother, not in a boarding school or with him. My mother found also that she needed a babysitter while she worked full time, so I was taken out of school and stayed at home to care for my youngest sister. As I spent each day at home, I began to feel sorry for myself, watching the neighborhood kids go to school in the mornings and come home in the afternoons. I wasn't fully aware yet of what an education would mean to me as I got older, but I knew that I missed the companionship of friends and my other brothers and sisters. Within a short time, I began to feel that the only way out was for me to get married and start a family of my own. I felt that my life was controlled by the needs of others and that I was losing the right to any personal happiness. I wanted clothes of my own, a bed of my own, a home of my own. I wanted a husband I could trust, one who would always love me no matter what happened in our lives. It was no wonder, then, that I fell hopelessly in love with the boy next door and married him the following spring. My father was adamantly against it, but I was living with my mother and she supported it. I was 15 and very naive as to what the demands of the real family were. Remember, this is like 80 years ago. The immaturity of us both and the fact that we had vastly different goals in life ended our marriage 6 years later. My dream was broken. I had a wounded soul that would take a lot of patience and love to heal. I have never regretted this marriage, though, because it gave me 4 beautiful children. My first were 2 girls, Donna and Cheryl, and then I had a son, Glenn. Our youngest, Cynthia, died at 3 months of SIDS. I met Joe at a the Christmas following my divorce. He was stationed at Steed Air Force Base near Reno, Nevada, where I was then living. Joe, too, had been through a divorce, and as I got to know him, I found that we had a lot in common. He had a background similar to my own, and also a desire for a strong family unit. He seemed to fit somehow. Even my children wanted him to be with us, perhaps more than I did at first, and the time came rapidly when we were married. From the beginning, it seemed almost too good to be true. Joe had a tenderness about him that I had not experienced before. He was tremendously patient with the children, yet firm enough that they responded to his love. They fought over who would be first at the door to greet him when he returned from work at night. Joe was dad to them from the beginning in every way. We wanted to remain together, and that combined with our growing maturity is the glue that has held us together through the years. As we moved from place to place and as we adjusted in our own lives, we simply made the commitment to work things out and keep our family together, no matter what the cost. Our desires were to the family first and ourselves second. In July of 1963, Joe was transferred to Randolph Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. Computers were making their debut, and Joe was assigned to learn computer programming. During our 4 years in Texas, I gave birth to two boys, Joseph Jr. and Stuart Jeffrey. We were living a dream come true. We had a new car and a new house, complete with air conditioning. The kids had plenty of clothes, and I was able to stay home and care for them. I truly felt blessed. The security and joy I felt now seemed an eternity away from the boarding schools and loneliness of my childhood and broken marriage. But still, I knew that something was missing. I still prayed, but my relationship with God seemed distant and filled with fear. I knew that He had answered my prayers from time to time, such as after my divorce when I had prayed for someone loving and patient to help me raise my children. He had literally led me to Joe. I believed that God was real and loved His children despite His professed vengeance, but I had no idea how to incorporate that love into my life or how to share it with my children. I discussed the matter with Joe and suggested that we begin attending church. He was less than enthusiastic, mostly because of earlier experiences that had disillusioned him about religion. I respected his position, but still sought a way to bring a stronger sense of religious belief into our family. We attended a few local churches, but we didn't feel satisfied, and after a while, I just let things go. My beliefs about religion would remain uncertain for many years. The nurse came into my room and interrupted my thoughts. She had a little cup of sleeping pills, but I refused them because of my aversion to almost any type of medication. My fear of drugs went back a long way, and I seldom even took aspirin, preferring instead to tough out a headache or illness. The nurse went out of the room, and I was left again with my thoughts. In the utter loneliness of the night, my thoughts now turned to the surgery just hours away. Would everything be all right? I had heard many stories of people dying on the operating table. Would I be another? Images of graveyards filled my mind. I conjured up scenes of tombstones and crosses around skeletons' necks and buried coffins. I began wondering about the last rites, something I had heard about in my youth. I tried to figure out why the dead wore crosses. Was it to show God that they were saints, or were the sinners who needed protection from the demons of hell? Gloom settled more strongly upon me, the darkness still tugging at me, and I reached over to the buzzer and called the nurse. Do you have any of those pills handy? I asked when she came in. She gave me a puzzled look for a moment, but she got the pills for me. I took them and thanked her as she turned down the lights and shut the door. It was a while before I felt drowsy, and finally I said my prayers and went to sleep. I think we're going to stop there for today. Um, I've read this whole book. Actually, I finished reading it this morning, and that's why I'm sharing it now, because of how beautiful it is and how touched I was by it. Um, so I hope you liked the story so far. There is much more to go, so Please tune in again and let me know what